damn, Lorraine, you're really coming out the gate with the big words and the societal commentary. Look at you dropping pension and propaganda and hierarchical society. And meanwhile, I'm like, are you Team Gail or Team Peter? Yeah.
Welcome back to the Booked on Fantasy podcast.
I'm Addison.
I'm Lorraine, and we are two best friends who explore the world of fantasy through book shows and movies, but with a heavy emphasis on books. Today, we are very excited to bring you our very first Paging the Past episode. I am super excited to talk about Hunger Games today, and I'm so glad we picked this as our series premiere book because it was so good. So quick spoiler warning, since our Paging the Past episodes will be structured more as book reviews instead of chapter by chapter deep dives, that means we will have spoilers for the entire first Hunger Games book, but no further than that. So you don't have to worry about spoilers for anything else. Furthermore, we would like to remind everyone that this is an adult podcast where we will have adult conversations. Explicit language or potentially triggering topics may be discussed, so please be mindful of that and adjust accordingly. Housekeeping. Now that we are finished with Onyx Storm, we are continuing our Throne of Glass coverage and picking up right where we left off with Empire of Storms. If you are just tuning in for the first time and you like what you're hearing with this episode, then feel free to browse our very extensive catalog of TFG and Onyx Storm content. All of our deep dive episodes are spoiler-free, so they're perfect for acting as your book buddy while you read. Next, our May Paging the Past episode will review the second Hunger Games book, Catching Fire, so you can expect that to come out like end of May. That's all for housekeeping. So as far as the episode goes, Addison will provide a quick book report to give a general summary of events, and then next we'll continue with some finer thoughts and reactions for each of the three parts of the book, so the tribute, the games, and the victor. And then at the end, we'll give our overall rating and some of our favorite moments to close out the episode. With that being said, Addison, please give us the book report.
Angrily.
With fire.
With fire. Katniss Everdeen spent every day hunting and foraging and bartering just so she and her little sister Prim and their mother could have enough to eat. And even with her relentless effort, there were still nights they went to bed hungry. She lived in District 12, the coal mining district, and the poorest of the 12 districts of Panem. Yet even the constant threat of starvation and the dangers of the mines weren't the deadliest things its citizens faced. That title belonged to the Hunger Games, an annual event where one boy and one girl from each district were selected to fight to the death, and a televised spectacle designed to remind the district of the capital's power. Each year, Katniss faced Reaping Day with dread, but this year was different. It was the first year her little sister Prim was old enough to also have her name placed in the reaping. Katniss's worst nightmare comes true when Prim's name is chosen, but Katniss, unwilling to let her sister face such a fate, volunteers in her place. Alongside her, Peeta Mellark, the baker's son, the boy with the bread, is chosen as the male tribute. Katniss and Peeta's journey to the capital begins under the guidance of their mentor, Haymitch Abernathy, a former victor who won the games 24 years earlier and has since numbed his trauma with alcohol. Upon arriving in the capital, they quickly realized that the Hunger Games are about more than just survival in the arena. The real competition began the moment their names were drawn. With the help of Haymitch and their escort, Effie Trinket, and their kind-hearted and creative stylist, Cinna, Katniss and Peeta begin to navigate the capital's games. Together, they lean into a strategy crafted by their team, presenting themselves as star-crossed lovers during their training sessions and the televised interviews to gain favor with potential sponsors and the audience. When the games begin, Katniss does her best to survive, trapping what food she can, sleeping in trees to stay out of reach of the career tributes, and battling starvation and dehydration. She eventually forms a bond with Rue, the 12-year-old tribute from District 11, whose quick thinking and quiet strength reminds Katniss of Prim. Together, they become allies. But tragedy strikes when Rue is caught in a net and killed. Devastated and furious at the capital for engineering such cruelty, Katniss gently covers Rue's body in wildflowers. A silent act of rebellion, a message that no matter how much the capital takes, there will always be a part of each tribute that the capital cannot own. As the games near their end, the capital introduces a shocking twist. For the first time, 2 tributes can be declared winners if they are from the same district. Katniss and Peeta reunite, and Katniss nurses Peeta back to health, risking her life to secure life-saving medicine during a feast staged by the game makers. Together, they beat the odds, even managing to defeat the formidable Cato in a brutal final battle at the cornucopia. But just as victory seems within reach, the capital reverses its earlier rule, announcing that only one tribute may win after all. In clear defiance of the capital's power, Katniss and Peeta threaten to eat a handful of poisonous nightlock berries, choosing to die together rather than play the capital's game. At the very last second, the capital relents, declaring them both victors, the first ever joint winners of the Hunger Games. But Katniss soon realizes that although she survived the arena, the real games are only just beginning. Her small acts of defiance, honoring Rue, outsmarting the capital with the berries, have ignited something far bigger than herself. They sparked the tinderbox of unrest simmering in the districts, and the capital is watching her closely now more than ever. What was meant to be a spectacle of control may have just sown the seeds of rebellion.
Ooh.
I know. I got shivers. I'm like, ooh. Even though I've read it, I still get so excited. I'm like,
Yes.
what's going to happen? I don't know. I love it.
I do too. There's something about dystopian fantasy books and series that
They're very
I just
gripping.
love them.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's something about them that like really draws you in. I felt the same way about Divergent until the travesty that was the last book. But for the first two, I was all about it.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for the book report. And now let's get into the discussion. To give some quick context, Addison has read the Hunger Games books before, but I have not. I have seen the first movie when it came out back in like high school, so I kind of remember major events because of that, but beyond that into the rest of the series, I have literally no idea what's to come. I was really excited actually because I've always heard The Hunger Games is such a great series, but for whatever reason I never read them. I also think it would be interesting to read a young adult series as an adult because I'm sure my perspective on some things will be different than what it would have been if I had read them when I was a teenager.
I was very excited to revisit this series as an adult because my worldview has changed so much since I first read the series. I now have children of my own, which obviously has changed my perspective. And I'm just in general, more of an adult. So it's easier for me to empathize and imagine the difficulties of starvation or work condition, as well as the politics that play a role in this book, whereas I probably couldn't appreciate that in the same way, especially for me having children, like the conversation with Gail and Katniss when they're talking about, oh, I would have kids if I didn't live here, blah, blah, blah. My husband was like, would you have kids? And I'm like, ooh, that's a hard question. I really don't know.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about. Yeah, it makes you think.
I also just in general have a huge love of anything dystopian or sci-fi in addition to traditional fantasy. So this was right up my alley.
I am very excited to reread this, but Twilight, that's what I'm really waiting for. Twilight was my Roman Empire. Also, just to reassure you, although I have read this entire series, including The Ballad of Songbird and Snake, which exists in the universe but is outside of this series, I have not read the recently released Sunrise on the Reaping, but we will be covering that. I will not give any spoilers for the rest of the series. At most, I will make vague comments like, remember this for later, or this is foreshadowing for future events, things like that, but I will not give any spoilers. I also rewatched the movie in anticipation of this episode, so I will be adding some fun color commentary about how the two compare, mostly complaints, because the movie is good, but it's really not as good as the book. That's such a cliche, but really, I'm like, you guys skip some like obvious, don't even get me started. You know what? We'll just talk about it in the episode.
Yeah, I will say in general, if you have never read the books or you didn't know about them and you start a series or a show that's based off of something, typically you'll probably be fairly happy with it. Like you won't notice a lot of stuff because you didn't know. But then obviously if you read the books first and then you go watch the show or watch the movie, my opinion tends to be that I will always prefer the books just because there's so much more detail. There's so many more events. Like you're getting inner thoughts and inner dialogue with characters and stuff. You just have so much more insight into what's going on than what you can realistically add into a show or a movie, right? Because those are constrained by time. You can only put so much in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm very curious to see how I will feel when we do Harry Potter eventually, how I will feel the books compared to the movies. Because in my opinion, I think the books are magnificent. I think the movies are magnificent.
Yeah.
But
yes.
I literally haven't read the book since they came out. So I'm curious now reading them and then watching the movie, I'll be like, wow, they miss so much stuff. Like if it will reignite my anger. Because in my mind, I'm like, they're both perfection. So I am excited to do that when eventually we talk about Harry Potter.
Anyways, so part 1, the tributes. One of the first things I noticed is how easily I was sucked into this book. I think the simple style of writing where there was nothing like superfluous definitely helped with that, but I also was immediately drawn into Katniss's character and situation as a young teen in District 12 within like a familiar world that basically faced extreme natural disasters leading to the destruction and reshaping of North America as we know it. And yet, despite all the hardship, you still see this development of an extremely hierarchical society fraught with class division, propaganda, and a penchant for keeping lower classes in line with violence and power. And I feel like that's always an interesting thematic lesson to see how even when terrible things happen to everyone, the lessons still aren't learned. And instead, you see this society that's rebuilt in possibly like a more extreme way to just like further divide people and then capitalize on a disastrous situation for power and profit that is exclusive to a certain group.
Damn, Lorraine, you're really coming out the gate with the big words and the societal commentary. Look at you dropping pension and propaganda and hierarchical society. And meanwhile, I'm like, are you Team Gail or Team Peeta? Yeah.
I like that too.
I know
I
you
like
did.
the dynamic between that stuff. But this is like one of the things about dystopian things that intrigue me so much. Because that's what a lot of dystopian stuff is about.
Yeah, it's a commentary on the pitfalls of society. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
I completely agree that there is something about this book and the world building that really just sucks you in. And overall, the writing, I think, just really helps draw you in. There's something about it that makes you just feel immediately invested in the story and immersed in the dystopian society that I think is really good. And I think part of that is the way she integrates the politics very seamlessly. It doesn't feel like you're getting this like political explanation. It's these subtle lines and conversations between characters where you're like, oh, this is how the Capitol does this. It's like the Tesseract is a good example of that. Or there's a bunch of things like that. And I think that's what makes it very well done, but also really interesting to read.
But it's also done in a way that's really easy to understand.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sure part of that is just the fact that it's young adult. And so I guess like the structure of the writing is...
It's more palatable.
I'm going to say, yeah, and it's more simple. And I don't mean that in like a bad way, but just more straightforward than perhaps it would be if you're looking at a book that's more geared for adults specifically. So anyways, obviously one such way to keep classes divided is with the Hunger Games. And this entire concept is completely nutty and awful. You're literally forcing children to fight and kill one another for entertainment.
Yup. It's horrible.
One of the quotes that I had to demonstrate this was a thought where it says, "This is the Capitol's way of reminding us how totally we are at their mercy. Look how we take your children and sacrifice them, and there's nothing you can do." Yikes.
Yeah.
But it gets worse. On top of forcing people to participate in the games, they also leverage people's desperation for resources with the Tesseract. I don't know. It's so beyond messed up to be like, yeah, you can get some rationed grain and oil that is not actually going to help you live that much. But in exchange, we're going to exponentially increase your odds of death. Enjoy. It's a lose-lose situation either way, but people have no other option, so they just get sucked further in.
That's one of the political aspects of the book that I found really engaging this reread. The Capitol has designed the system so flawlessly to keep people oppressed. In a way, it's brilliant. You almost have to admire it because it's just so well thought out. Obviously, it's not good, but I mean, it's really interesting to read. Something else that stood out to me is when Katniss is describing how people rarely go beyond the fence to gather or hunt because they have been told repeatedly it's unsafe and it's a gift, quote unquote, that the Capitol keeps them safe within the perimeters of the fence. And Katniss thinks, District 12, where you can starve to death in safety. And there's something so clarifying about that. They're so beaten down and almost brainwashed that they're too scared to do anything, even a small act of rebellion, literally for survival. They're literally too afraid to go past the fence, to hunt, to gather. And so they feel safer and better starving in a controlled environment. And that's just
Right.
unhinged. It's crazy.
Well, it's like realistically, if you go outside the fence and hunt, you're going to get way more food than what you're
Yeah.
getting being within the fence. And that's like the most frustrating thing about this is that they keep you contained, make you scared to go outside of that because you think you're going to die or be killed or whatever. And yet doing that and breaking the rules is like the thing that could easily help you actually live and survive. It's a false sense of safety and security that the capitalists created. So
Mm-hmm.
another thing that I found really interesting is that objectively, I know the entire concept of the Hunger Games and what's going on with the Capitol and the way that they've designed the districts and everything is like really fucked up. And yet I was simultaneously hooked because you're so invested in Katniss and Peeta and you want them to live and survive. So now you're participating in the games as well from a viewing perspective. But also, I feel like just in reading dystopian sci-fi types of worlds and books, there is often this weird part of human psychology that is like fascinated with things that are super messed up because deep down, they touch on parts of human nature that are not typically acceptable in society, or they show you the extremes of what could happen if
you strip down the things that make us humans.
the things that make us like
humanity.
compassionate and like morally good and like well behaved and whatnot, then you could very quickly like
if you
go
strip
down
away the
that path.
comforts, what are we like in our base human form? Yeah, I mean, I think that's why shows like The Last of Us or The Walking Dead are so popular.
The Last of Us.
Oh my gosh.
I love that
Okay,
show.
my husband has been watching it. It's not really good for my mental health to watch shows like that, I'll be totally honest. But it's so captivating. I have done a lot of like side-eye watching, and so I'm moderately invested. And then for those of you who watch it, episode 2 just came out, and I did watch most of the episode. I was like more upset than my husband, and I haven't even really watched it. And he's like, "Are you good?" I was like, "No, I'm angry."
Not.
So
Yeah,
sorry. Back to it, but.
Oh my gosh, if you guys have not watched Last of Us, I love that show. It's so good. Anyways, but yeah, just in general, I feel like there's such a huge subgroup and there's such a huge market for documentaries and podcasts and shows about serial killers and cults and dystopian societies and all this stuff. And they're horrific, but you're still like so
You don't want to look away.
them. Yeah.
You're like side-eye watching.
Yep,
just to
exactly.
see what happens.
To move on to some of the key moments as far as events of the chapter goes, these were some things that hit us emotionally or were really thought-provoking.
Something I took note of from the very first chapter is when we're getting the download about Katniss's family dynamics, how she has this deep-seated mistrust of her mother because when her father died in a tragic mine accident, she went basically catatonic and was essentially just sitting there watching her children starve to death. When Katniss is talking to Gale in the woods at the beginning of the book, she thinks, leave. How could I leave Prim, who is the only person in this world I'm certain I love? And this is such a loaded quote coming right out of the gate that has so many layers as you read the rest of the book. She has these confusing feelings for Gale and Peeta, her difficult relationship with her mother. I also want to note that this quote to me is really important to remember as we progress through this series because her love and devotion to Prim is something that really drives her actions, not only in this book, but also in future books. And so I think retrospectively, having read this series, it's fun now, like kind of analyzing, and I'm like, wow, they really set us up for X, Y, and Z without even me knowing, So just keep that in mind, Lorraine, okay?
And I think Prim's also the only person that she's really allowed herself to love. So, like, that's kind of a theme that I feel like I picked up on later is that she really didn't give herself any time to think about loving anybody else because it's not a priority for her state and, like, the conditions that they live in. So
I think for her, love is a luxury she can't afford, and she can only afford it for Prim because Prim is also very innocent. Her entire character is basically a helpless little duck. So she feels this responsibility to love and care for her.
One of my first favorite scenes was the whole reaping scene when Prim is called, but Katniss volunteers instead. And we have the I volunteer as tribute. And then watching everybody touch their lips and like raise their fingers into the air. I have that scene burned into my memory from the movie. If there's nothing else that I remembered, it was definitely going to be that scene. It was so iconic and symbolic, you know? And then one of my favorite quotes from that scene is when she thinks, so instead of acknowledging applause, I stand there unmoving while they take part in the boldest form of dissent they can manage. Silence.
I think the word iconic is just perfect. This scene really is. It is the Hunger Games, right? Say Hunger Games. Even if you've never read the book or seen the movie, I guarantee you know I volunteer as tribute. And I remember the very first time I ever read this book, as soon as the story started, immediately I was like, oh, so Katniss is going to get picked, or Gale, or maybe both. Maybe they're going to get picked and try to run away. I don't know. My mind was going all these different places. And then when it's Prim, I was like, what? Like, that is not how I saw it going at all. So that's such a really fun plot twist to throw in.
But I feel like that really played into the panic that you see from Katniss is because it was so unexpected and Prim is so young. She was just reaching the age at which 12. She could even be picked in the first place. Then her to just get like picked right away, you're like...
I was thinking about the math of it because in the book, Katniss says you're only in there one time. And then she's talking to Gale and she's like, how many times are you in it? And it multiplies each year and he takes tesserae every month for each family member, right? By the time you're 18, depending how big your family is, you could have potentially 100 or more, you know, hundreds of entries. And then you compound that by how many kids there are in the district. And you're like, the odds of Prim getting picked are so astronomical. So lim. Like, she really has some bad luck.
Then right after that, we have Peeta. He gets called and we get the flashback from Katniss when she was 11 and basically saved them from the brink of starvation by purposefully burning some bread so that he could give it to Katniss.
The boy with the bread.
The boy with the bread. Just like thinking by the end of the story how we've learned that he's just had a crush on her basically their entire lives so far. And you're like, oh my God, Peeta. It made me tear up because, you know, Peeta has always been this kind, compassionate person from the very beginning. And I think that he stayed that way throughout at least this first book so far. I think it also totally set us up for the romance story that spun during the games. You have the extra layer being that it was true for Peeta. But for Katniss, it's first and foremost a strategy, but she starts to get confused about how she really feels as we go on. So I'm going to talk about this again when we get into part 3, but that's all I have to say.
Sounds a pain.
Yeah.
You're going to be doing a lot of that in this episode. I'm going to tell you that right now.
Mm-hmm. The next scene that I really liked was when Katniss gets picked up from the train, and I found it really touching that Peter's father came to visit Katniss and brought her the cookies and then also promised to watch out for Prim. It's clear Peter's father is another gentle soul, but also we learn later that his father loved Katniss's mom. And I was like, damn, there's some generational love going on in this family.
Something about those Everdeens, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. And then after that, you know, Katniss thinks, people deal with me, but they are genuinely fond of Prim. Maybe there will be enough fondness to keep her alive. I found the juxtaposition of Katniss and Prim's personalities and energies just kind of interesting to keep in mind.
I really liked this moment as well. Even though I've read the series before, when I was reading it this time, I just kept thinking, why did he come visit her? What was his purpose? Because he just gives her the cookies and he sits there. And later when Peter reveals the history between his dad and Katniss's mom, even though nothing ever really happened, but it seemed like he liked her, loved her, whatever, had feelings for her, it all clicks into place and it makes so much sense that he's always had a soft spot for Katniss and her family. Yeah. It's very well woven through the narrative of the story.
I also feel like there's probably a decent amount of respect. He buys their, I think, rabbits. Is it rabbits from them?
Squirrels. He's fond of squirrels, okay, but not when that witch of a wife is around.
She's been hardened by the seam.
Apparently.
But yeah, and so like he has that relationship with Katniss as well. So I would imagine that plays into it too. I guess also from that train scene, I loved the symbolism of Madge giving Katniss the gold Mockingjay pin and everything about how the Mockingjay connects her father's story and then Rue's story and then just this general thematic story of resistance, you know?
I do have to complain here only because they completely eliminate Madge's character from the movie, which is super disappointing because Madge doesn't play a huge role in future books, but her character is important and symbolically what she represents to Katniss, because Katniss doesn't really have any friends other than Gale, and Madge is kind of in this soft spot. So I was very disappointed that they omitted Madge from the movie.
Boo.
That's right. Boo.
So next, we start getting into the Katniss Peeta stuff. And I did find Katniss's attitudes towards Peeta in the first part just a little off-putting. We get this whole story of how Peeta basically like saved her life, but despite that, she's like, a kind Peeta Malark is far more dangerous to me than an unkind one.
I like that.
No, I know. And then she goes on and says, kind people have a way of working their way inside me and rooting there, and I can't let Peeta do this. I know that she's just trying to maintain distance, and like, I get it. Katniss is a true realist, and she understands that at the end of the day, in the games, there can only be one winner. So it's kind of much easier to keep Peeta at a distance because that will make it easier to kill him if it ever came down to it. But my heart obviously hated that.
Something that I found really intriguing from part one was just the overall strategy of the games in general. There is so much more to winning them than just being strong and good with a weapon. Yeah. Every moment from the time they get reaped to the time they step into the arena is curated to the tiniest detail, all to present this image, this strategy, the costuming, the social interactions, everything. And I found that part of the book much more engaging and interesting this time, is really thinking about how calculated every moment is. We'll talk about this later, like in the scene where Haymitch is prepping Katniss for the interview, and they're going through all the archetypes, right? Are you strong? Are you brave? Are you fierce? Are you cunning? Are you shy? Are you sweet? And then also kind of how Katniss does not fit into any of those molds. She's just like generically unlikable, but somehow extremely igniting to people. And that's, I think,
captivating at the same time.
Captivating. Yes. There's something about her. We'll talk about it later, but I was thinking about the quote. She doesn't know the effect she has on people.
Yes. And I guess diving into, as they start preparing for everything, I was really curious to learn more about Cinna. Right off the bat, I liked him because he seems very down to earth despite where he lives and what he does. You know, Katniss describes him as being pretty much himself. Like, he doesn't have any of the usual appearance changes or anything extra to him like she's used to seeing from people in the Capitol. And I also found it interesting that this was his very first year in the games, but he actually was the one to ask for District 12, and I wonder why that is. I started feeling like there is some underground resistance going on with Cinna and Haymitch. I get the vibe that they have been kind of like biding their time, waiting for the right opportunity. And then this year with District 12 finally came to be that point because they got tributes that they thought actually had a chance at winning with. And so I'm gonna keep my eye on. Keep my eye on what's going on here.
No, it's funny you say that with Cinna because he definitely read more rebellious to me on this reread. Some of his comments, he's like, you must think we're so abhorrent, or I'm sorry this happened to you, right? Really this acknowledgement of the cruelty of the Capitol, which I can imagine for other stylists is unheard of. Like, think about her prep team. They're just blithering idiots who are like, oh, you're so lucky you got this opportunity. And Cinna is very realistic about the serious nature of it. And I think there's evidence to support what you're saying at the end when he's prepping her for her final interview. They're having that very coded message where he's like, I thought Peeta would enjoy this dress.
Yeah.
And so you're right.
Race.
He's like, you see what I'm saying, girl? You know, like, I think you're right. It does give like this kind of subtle undertone of a rebellious nature at bare minimum.
I also found this quote really poignant, and it was, what must it be like, I wonder, to live in a world where food appears at the press of a button? How would I spend the hours I now commit to combing the woods for sustenance if it were so easy to come by? What do they do all day, these people in the Capitol, besides decorating their bodies and waiting around for a new shipment of tributes to roll in and die for their entertainment? There is something to the idea of what happens over time when there is too much of everything available at the touch of a button with little to no effort involved to get things that you need or want. I generally believe that, the effort put into achieving a task or a goal is a big part of the reward system and the satisfaction you feel from those tasks. But when you remove that effort, then it creates a slippery slope into needing more extravagance or like extreme entertainment or focusing on outward-facing factors as a means to cope with what is actually just extreme boredom and dissatisfaction.
Okay, Mom.
But
You sound like my parents. You have to work for what you want in this life, or you won't really appreciate it. No, but really, I think you're totally right. I think that is very poignant analysis.
Thank you. But I also think Katniss even points to this later on. She realizes that she'd always felt most grounded and happy when she was just outside hunting. Even when they were starving and poor, her life felt like it had more purpose and importance compared to living in a bubble of curated existence and extravagance. I'm not saying by any means that one should be happy being starved and poor. That's not great for
That's
anybody.
not what we're promoting on this podcast.
But it's more so just the idea of, more things won't necessarily equal more satisfaction and happiness.
I had this exact quote pulled out as well. The lead up to this quote is what really got me. She's eating this dinner in the Capitol and she's trying to imagine what it would take for her to assemble this meal back home. And she walks us through her process of how she would do it, right? She would have to hunt and trade. And she goes through this whole mental exercise. And it would literally take days in hunting or bartering, all for this one meal, which would still be a poor imitation for what the Capitol can produce. And to me, that really just highlights that starvation is used as a tool to keep them oppressed, and not because it keeps them physically weak, but because when you literally spend every waking moment of your existence focused on survival, you don't have time or energy for rebellion. You don't have time to question the morals and ethics of society and what's fair and what's just. You're just hoping that you can eat a meal that day.
Yeah. Make it to the next day.
Literally, no. And then to hear Katniss's perspective of she hunts all day and does all of these things. And there are still nights where they go to bed hungry despite all of her effort. And so it's just such a huge juxtaposition between the Capitol and the districts.
It's very jarring.
Just is. It's very jarring. Yeah.
I agree. So to move on, I really loved Katniss and Peeta's costumes for the opening ceremonies. And this was another one of those scenes that I remember very vividly in my brain from the movie. And I really liked her quote when she says, "No one will forget me, not my look, not my name. Katniss, the girl who was on fire."
Retweet. Just remember that girl on fire metaphor, because that's going to be a thing. I mean, the next book is literally called Catching Fire. So, run with that.
Yeah.
Another moment from part 1 that lives rent-free in my head, which I cannot believe they omitted from the movie, is after the opening ceremonies, Effie is talking to them and she says, "But I said," and this was very clever of me, I said, "Well, if you put enough pressure on coal, it turns to pearls." There's something about Effie that just makes her so inherently likable. And I know technically she's part of the Capitol and she helps facilitate the games, but in her own way, I feel like she really does care for Peeta and Katniss. And so I really enjoyed all of Effie's dialogue in the scenes she was in. Although I will say in the movie, they did include the scene where Katniss is talking to Haymitch and she stabs the table. And Effie is like, "That is mahogany." And I love that line. So it kind of balances because both of those lines are pure gold. And that is mahogany did not happen in the book. The movie's definitely worth watching. I'm going to complain about it, but you guys should definitely watch it.
Yeah, I agree. I liked Effie, even though she is a product of the Capitol. But she doesn't seem ill-intended in the same way President Snow or the people at the top of the Capitol really are. So
I also thought this was super important to remember as we progress through the series. When Katniss and Peeta are having a conversation with Haymitch about their abilities and skills, Peeta says she has no idea the effect she can have. And I love this quote because, once again, there are so many layers of meaning to it. Obviously, in this moment, the effect she has on Peeta, but throughout this book and later in the series, there is something unique about Katniss, and she's completely oblivious to it. She has no idea. For example, her effect on the game makers in her private session with Rue and District 11 and how she inspired them to send her bread, which is just unheard of. And then later on, even with Thresh lets her go in a game that is literally for his life. And it's because there's something about her and the effect she has on people.
I think it's because Katniss doesn't, well, in some ways it's to her detriment because she doesn't quite understand the social game behind the Hunger Games. Because at the end of the day, like that's like the major thing is, yes, you need to have skills to survive and do things, but it's less so about that than it is about how do you play to the audience, to the Capitol, to everybody around you and make yourself appear worthy of winning to those people, regardless of whether or not you actually have the skills that would consider you like winnable. And so I don't think Katniss quite understands that aspect until later. She kind of like grabs a hold of it and starts to get it later. But in the beginning, it feels like she's like totally oblivious to doing that because it's not something that she's had to do before. She's used to living like very cut and dry, I guess, like transactional. I give you a rabbit, you give me bread. Things are very obvious. Like what you want and what you're trading for is very clear, I guess. But, you know, social games are much more subtle. They're a little more insidious, you know. Anyways, it goes without saying, I think, that I love Peeta and his gentle spirit and soul. So I love seeing some insight into his talents and the things that he enjoys when they were in the training center. And there was a quote that I liked that said, "Then we move on to camouflage. Peeta genuinely seems to enjoy the station, swirling a combination of mud and clay and berries around his pale skin, weaving disguises from vines and leaves. I do the cakes," he admits to me. This highlights more of Peeta's artistic side, I guess, but also I like that this was some foreshadowing for Peeta's strategy later on. Last but not least, of course, Katniss's private session with the game makers. Chef's kiss on that. It was such a badass scene. And the quote that I pulled for it was, "The arrow skewers the apple in the pig's mouth and pins it to the wall behind it. Everyone stares at me in disbelief. And then she just walks out, like doesn't wait to be dismissed. She's like, bye."
Oh yeah, this is such a great scene to read and to watch. And in my opinion, it is easily one of the best moments of the book and probably the entire series. For me, it's the "thank you for your consideration" before she walks out. It's just so something. But it's so Katniss. Yeah. It's so Katniss.
True.
And it works.
Yeah. Speaking of Katniss, so we have a little bit of character analysis for this first part here. In this first third, I found Katniss to be, you know, a bit rough around the edges, but I actually didn't mind it. Didn't find it super off-putting, despite what everyone says about her being not very likable, you know? But ultimately, she is a young girl toughened by the world she grew up in, and I don't blame her for having little room for anything outside of the necessities. But you can tell that she does really care for everyone deeply, even if she's not really super showy about it, like getting the goat for Prim, caring for their mother in the house, her friendship and hunting collaboration with Gale so that both of their families could survive, and overall her ability to quickly learn how to not only get food, but then go on to like understand how to trade and bargain for things and get other resources that she needs by understanding the needs and wants of other people in the Seam and the Hob and the district. And I think that takes a lot of social intelligence, but it's a different kind compared to what she has to do in the Capitol and like the Hunger Games and everything. And I also find Katniss's relationship with her mother and Prim really interesting. Her mom was dealing, you know, with severe depression of sorts and a lot of grief over her husband's sudden and tragic death. I understand why Katniss was angry because she was forced to grow up so fast because her mom basically just shut down entirely without any explanation. And it robbed her of her childhood and innocence, and it's not fair to do to a child. And there wasn't anything that she could do about it, right? It's either like she starves and dies because her mom isn't available, or she adapts and continues on. But you know that had like a really strong impact on her. And it foundationally changed how Katniss viewed her mother and ultimately made her lose trust in her, which I think is really sad. The quote that I think really summed this up really well was when she thinks, "One time my mother told me that I always eat like I'll never see food again. And I said, I won't unless I bring it home." That shut her up. I was like, whoa.
Ooh, they certainly have a combative relationship, if nothing else. Something else I found interesting about Katniss's character is that her rebellious nature is foreshadowed very early on in the book. It's described, When I was younger, I scared my mother to death. The things I would blurt out about District 12, about the people who ruled our country, Pan Am. Eventually, I understood this would only lead us to more trouble. So I learned to hold my tongue and turn my features into an indifferent mask that no one could ever read my thoughts. And when you think about this book as a whole, Katniss is unintentionally always pushing back on the Capitol. And it seems like there's just something that has been ingrained in her from a very early age that makes her this way. I think the beginning, she's not intending to show up the Capitol, but she just can't help it. It's just something that's just a part of her. I also like the character insight of how once she realizes the consequences of that kind of talk, she learned to keep her face completely indifferent. And I just have to say that makes so much sense with her character throughout the book and how she portrays herself, but also in the movie. It really explains how Jennifer Lawrence always had like a very flat affect for her. And I think she did a fantastic job of that because playing indifferent with an undercurrent of true feelings is extremely difficult. And people really underestimate how challenging that is. And Jennifer Lawrence, I mean, she is Katniss Everdeen. Okay, she is her.
Forever and always.
I'm like actually afraid they'll remake these movies, even though I would probably like that just because like it's fun for them to do it with new technology and all that.
Right.
But how can you can't beat the casting of Katniss Everdeen. I mean, come on.
I 100% agree. I always liked Jennifer Lawrence in the role, and I think she fit the character really well. I think there is definitely a part of Katniss's personality that she just always had. She was just born that way. But then you also know there's a part of it that was trained into her because of how she grew up. You see how she struggled to adapt at first to a different game that relies a lot on social perception. And then as she like transitions and navigates the Capitol in the games environment. But you always had this question of if you grow up in a different circumstance, what would you have turned out like? I think that's a really interesting kind of thought experiment to play sometimes. So
not good. Not good is how I would have turned out.
Do you care to elaborate or not today?
Catch me outside.
Okay,
How about that?
Okay. So the next character to kind of briefly touch on is Peeta. I loved Peeta immediately. He is just a down-to-earth, compassionate, artsy person with a kind heart. He wasn't meant for these games.
He's just a baby.
He's just a baby. But I really like that he didn't let Katniss's kind of realism is how I would describe her like outlook. He didn't necessarily let that get to him, and that, I mean, honestly, Peeta's really emotionally intelligent. I think that is one of his best attributes. And he's also really altruistic. Katniss feels betrayed by Peeta wanting to be treated separately, but we see later that this was all part of the social game Peeta was playing to best help Katniss because he knew deep down that she had the best chance of surviving. Honestly, it was a brilliant strategy. It was something that had never been done or never been seen before, and I think Peeta had a role in instigating that.
You know, I loved Peeta before we started recording this episode, and just hearing you talk about him, I just love him even more. I mean, who doesn't love Peeta? How can you not, you know? Although I believe in truth and honesty on this podcast, and I will tell you, the very first time I read the series, at the end of this book, I was still very Team Gale. So
I wonder why that is. Like, it's just because I feel like I had a little bit of a similar sentiment. I don't know if I was like really gung-ho about it, but I do kind of remember being like, no, it's Gale that she wants, like deep down. But
well, I think it's because of the way she thinks about Gale, and we see Gale through her viewpoint. And although she says she only loves Prim, it's obvious she cares very deeply for Gale. And so for someone who really almost kind of admits they don't even love their own mother or can't forgive their own mother, to see someone else that they let in through their defenses, I think, can naturally feel drawn towards them.
Right. And I think it plays into this idea of like how Katniss didn't really allow herself to ever
entertain
consider
the idea
Gale as anything but a friend. Right. And so you don't know what would have happened.
What could it be?
If she had, I guess. So speaking of Gale, actually, Gale, I think, projects a very steadfast, realist demeanor, which is really similar to Katniss. And I think that familiarity and shared understanding is a lot of why Katniss feels so comfortable with Gale. They are very much the same in many ways, and there's always like a huge value, I think, in finding a person who you can trust and don't need to explain yourself to. And there's a quote where she thinks, I call him my friend, but in the last year it seemed too casual a word for what Gale is to me. Gale and I were thrown together by a mutual need to survive. PETA and I know that other survival means our own death. How do you sidestep that?
I also want to take note of the scene where Gale and Katniss take the strawberries to the mayor's house and they have that interaction with Madge. And it's described, Gale knows his anger at Madge is misdirected. On other days deep in the woods, I've listened to him rant about how the Tesserae are just another tool to cause misery in our district, a way to plant hatred between the starving workers at the seam and those who can generally count on supper, and thereby ensuring we will never trust one another. It's the capital's advantage to have us divided among ourselves, he might say, if there were no ears to hear but mine. And I pointed this quote out for two reasons. The first is that I think, as we've been discussing, it speaks to yet another way the capital controls the districts and prevents them from uniting in rebellion. If they sow division between the haves and have-nots within the districts themselves, when you think about it, it's kind of a crazy concept. They're all poor as hell.
Right.
They're poor as fuck. Like, nobody has anything, right? And somehow to even create a class system within the poorest class is brilliant and terrible. I think that's really interesting to think about. And this also speaks to Gale's character and his political views. I know Gale is basically not in this book at all and not really prominently featured other than through the lens of how Katniss views him, but this is definitely foreshadowing for future books and will become important later. So definitely remember this about Gale.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. And then I think the last character that I wanted to talk about for this first part is just Haymitch. We don't learn much about him other than that he was a previous winner, and then now he serves as a sponsor for District 12 and is honestly constantly drunk and insufferable most of the time. But throughout the story, it becomes very clear there is a very tragic backstory to Haymitch, most likely in relation to the games and his experience with it, that I am very curious about. I really want to learn more about what happened to him.
I will tell you, you will learn a little bit more in the second book. But the most recently released book, Sunrise on the Reaping, for those of you who don't know, it tells the story of Haymitch's game, which was even more notable because it was the 50th Hunger Games, making it the second quarter quell. I don't think this is explicitly explained in this book, but it's not really a spoiler, so I'm going to roll with it. Every 25 years, there is a quarter quell where some special provision is thrown into the games. I won't tell you what they are because that would be a spoiler, but we'll definitely talk about it more in the second book because Katniss won the 74th Hunger Games, which means the very next games will be the third quarter quell. And so they're going to throw in this even more horrible extra element to the games. And so Haymitch is especially notable because not only was he the second tribute to ever win from District 12, but he won a quarter quell. And so I'm very excited to read Sunrise on the Reaping because it's the story of his games. Something else I thought was really important when thinking about Haymitch's character is when in chapter 23, they're talking about Haymitch's game, Katniss thinks maybe in the beginning he tried to help the tributes, but then it got unbearable. It must be hell to mentor two kids and then watch them die year after year. And when you put that into perspective with his behavior in part one, it makes a lot more sense. Because I think immediately you're like, dude, fuck you, Haymitch. Like, the least you can do is help these kids. Like, they're probably going to die. Right. But then when you think about Haymitch's games, which I know we don't know anything about, but you know he won a fucking Hunger Games, so there's going to be some trauma there, right? And then you think about how year after year, let's see, 24 years, 48 tributes, and he's basically like prepping them for slaughter. And that has just got to destroy you. It really helps you understand, like, should I probably be an alcoholic too? You know, because it's terrible. And yet again, even when you win the games, you don't really win.
You don't win. Yeah. It's a lose-lose no matter what. I had that quote tagged for later too. And I think it's really important in terms of why Haymitch also feels so connected to Katniss and like why he all of a sudden stepped it up in this games is because for the first time, he also felt hope that he gets tributes that he may not have to watch die. That has to like change your perspective a little bit. And then you feel, you know, hope, that fickle little hope, you know,
it's dangerous.
Makes you like care and it makes you,
Well, and in the
try
movie,
a little more, you know.
And in the movies, actually, the game maker plays a more notable role in the movie. President Snow has a conversation with the game maker where he's basically like alluding to the idea that Katniss is starting to cause unrest with her behavior. And he has this whole conversation about like, do you know why we have the games? Like why we have a victor? It would be much more efficient to take 24 kids from the districts and just line them up and shoot them. Why do we go through the process of the games? And he said, hope. It's the one thing that's more dangerous than fear. And it's a tool that Snow uses to manipulate and maneuver the districts. I think that thematic element gets touched on more in the next book, but in the movie it gets talked about for this book. But either way, it's very relevant to the story.
So that ends part 1. Moving on to part 2, the games. Overall, I was really fascinated by how the games, the surface level of what that means has to do with the actual survival challenge between all the tributes. But then you have the subtle, more sinister sublayer that is just as important, if not more, to winning the games. And that is the social game that's involved with perception to an audience and the Capitol, as I kind of touched on earlier. Haymitch's words to Katniss post that first interview also really stuck out to me. And he said, who cares? It's all a big show. It's all about how you're perceived. The most I could say about your interview was that you were nice enough, although that in itself was a small miracle. Now I can say you're a heartbreaker. What do you think will get you more sponsors? Katniss's, individual survival skills and intelligence were certainly half of what allowed her to stay alive, but the true, life-saving things came in the form of gifts from sponsors or audience members watching. We had the bread from District 11, the broth for Peeta, and then the sleep medicine so that she could leave Peeta and then get the actual medicine that she needed to save Peeta's life. And really, those last 2 gifts were because of the romance charade that the audience wanted to see. They had nothing to do with how much they necessarily individually cared about Katniss and Peeta. It was the story and I guess just their enjoyment of love between them, right? So...
The interview prep was also really interesting to me, especially how Katniss describes each tribute has a category they fall into. The brute, the broody, the confident, the arrogant, shy, coy, brave. And the list just goes on and on. That there's all of these character archetypes that they put their tributes into. In the movie, I forget who says it, but one of the characters is like, I think Haymitch says it. I think he's like, it's a TV show, sweetheart. Give them a show. There's something about that. You're just like, this is so just fucked up, right? Not only do they have to do all this and they enjoy it, you have to put on this false air about yourself. You have to put yourself into an archetype and act all for the privilege of getting murdered, which is just, it's crazy. It's crazy. I know I say that a lot when you're not reading it. When you start talking about it, you're like, damn, why did I read this? This is fucked up.
It's just really depressing.
Yeah. I have to say also, just thinking about the interviews and everything, I would pay a lot of money to see what Gail's reaction and internal thoughts were during Peeta's interview. Really for the whole book, which we'll talk about later because I have some notes about that. But specifically for this, because they're all required to watch it. And so I would love to see what Gail's reaction was in this moment. Because I feel like it's safe to say in this book, Gail has feelings for Katniss. Although Katniss doesn't have feelings for him, or she's not allowed herself to explore the possibility.
She hasn't. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I have questions about that later, and I definitely feel like her exploration of her relationships with Gail and Peeta and sorting out her feelings and stuff are going to be kind of like a big thing moving into the next book. I also found all the different tactics used to drive tributes into fighting quite interesting. So much technology and innovation developed purely for cruelty, entertainment, and shock factor is such a slap in the face to everyone in the districts watching. You can do all of this shit for a game to kill children, but you refuse to do anything to make everyone's lives better in general. It irks me. I mean, just thinking of some of these things, you have the tracker jackers and all the systems designed to change the weather or create the fire within the arena. And then those weird wolf tribute hybrid things.
The mutations.
Yes. But as far as some of my favorite scenes and quotes go from part 2, these were some of the ones that stuck out. I think the rooftop scene the night before the games when Peeta tells Katniss, I want to die as myself. I don't want them to change me and turn me into some kind of monster that I'm not. I keep wishing I could think of a way to show the Capitol they don't own me, that I'm more than just a piece in their games. This was really interesting to me for Peeta's character. he really sees the bigger importance of their role within the system, with which Katniss is still primarily concerned with purely surviving. I think Peeta's role as a character is to be sort of like the dreamer within the dystopian books. He's kind of the character that looks beyond their direct reality. And he, to the realists of the story, seem overly idealistic. Like, Katniss doesn't understand the symbolism of that type of resistance and what Peeta is referring to because she is the realist character and she views survival as the most important factor. I would also imagine that she views Peeta as somewhat hopeless at this time because we see that Peeta has basically accepted that he really didn't have a chance at winning, primarily because he wouldn't have the heart to kill others or Katniss in the end. And so the way that he views it is different from Katniss, who doesn't want to die. She's like, no, I'm not dying today, okay? But I also felt like it really speaks to this idea of maintaining individuality in the face of a system that wants you to be or do something else. Like, how do you remain true to yourself when it would be so easy to let yourself become what a system selects for? In the case of the games, it's becoming like a cold, ruthless killer, right?
I really think this is one of the most iconic scenes from this series. It really sets a tone for how the games play out and ultimately for the series. Lorraine, I think you did a beautiful job of laying out the symbolic nature of this conversation. But ultimately, when you strip this conversation down at its very core, it foreshadows all of the characters' journey on deciding whether they will fight against the Capitol or continue to exist under their oppressive rule. I also think this is foreshadowing for how the games end and the evolution of Katniss's character. After Rue's death and being a quote-unquote piece in the Capitol's game, she comes around to share Peeta's viewpoint, which is a huge departure from her own response now in this scene when she literally tells Peeta, only, no offense, but who cares, Peeta? Which is kind of crazy because Peeta's been having this really vulnerable, like, retrospective
existential
moment. Existential. And she's like, who cares? But I mean, in her defense, in the book, she's like, I can't afford to think like that, right? I can only focus on winning the games. And so to see her do such a 180 from this moment in such a short time really shows her character's growth.
So as soon as the games begin, I found it really interesting that Peeta joins the group of career tributes. Because at first you're like, why would he do that? But then you see how it all unfolds and that it was all a careful plan for Peeta to continue crafting the image and draw the group away from Katniss. And I was like, oh, Peeta.
Oh my gosh, Lorraine, when I was reading this part, I was dying thinking about your reaction. Because the very first time you read this, you think, oh my gosh, this has been Peeta's strategy the whole time. It's why he decided to be coached separately. And you feel like it validates all of Katniss's suspicions leading up to the game. She's like, maybe he's, trying to undercut me. This is all part of his strategy. And then you see him with the career tributes and you're like, that motherfucker. Like, we got by Peeta and his soft brown eyes, the boy with the bread, all that nonsense. But then you find out that's not the case.
Not at all. I always loved her. Yeah. I never believed Katniss's little, sidelines.
Not even when he showed up with the careers?
No, because I was always just remembering who Peeta was at the core and how Katniss could not understand Peeta's viewpoint. I never let go of that, of him saving her life. And I was like, that is the Peeta we know. Okay.
Well, you're better than Katniss. So. You're way better than her. Another one of my favorite scenes is the Tracker Jacker scene. Suzanne Collins really did a great job with her world building and blending technology with nature and how the Capitol used that to their advantage. Obviously, the Mockingjays are important, but later on with the mutations and, of course, the Tracker Jackers in this scene. What an absolutely clever plan that Katniss and Rue cooked up, and it was just really exciting to read. It was also horrible. Let me just caveat that, but you get what I mean. I know the tension of that and just how the poison affected her hallucinations and everything. So I have to ask, as essentially a first-time reader, what was this scene like for you?
I had a lot of anxiety during that scene. You started off with Katniss sleeping in this tree, and she doesn't know what's going on. Then Rue's like, hey, you're in danger. Just turn around and don't move. And then it evolves into, okay, we can actually use this to our advantage, but it's gonna cost us a little bit. And then, Oh, I don't even want to imagine what that felt like to get stung by them, because I haven't been stung by a bee in a really long time. But recently, like a couple months ago at this point, I did get stung by I think it was a yellow jacket. And
Ooh.
honestly, that shit hurts,
Did it really?
Yeah, and it continued to hurt for at least a couple hours, and then it was fine. It wasn't like unbearable pain or anything, but it definitely hurt more than I was expecting. So then to have these like things that just track you down and inject you with a poison,
Super poison.
Furious, it can kill you. I know. I was like, oh my God, no.
So fun fact about me, I've never been stung by anything. I've never been stung by a bee,
Really?
wasp. No, never. So actually, I have this morbid fear that I'm actually like lethally allergic to bees. And if I get stung, I'll go into anaphylactic shock. So I've never been stung, but I'm also really afraid to get stung. Besides, there's like this irrational fear, but I can imagine it would not feel great.
Yeah, it's not fun. I mean, mostly it feels like a pinprick, but I feel like it's more shocking or surprising than anything else. And so then you react
Like,
because of
ow!
like the
Yeah.
shock of like, what was that, So, but
Fair enough.
lucky for you. I hope the odds are in your favor that you never get stung.
Thank you.
So, of course, another one of the most just impactful scenes with everything that happened with Rue. Their alliance and friendship, their respect for each other, their clever plan to blow up supplies, and most importantly, the symbolism of Katniss singing and making the wreath of flowers when Rue died. I kind of figured, well, obviously from the movie, I knew Rue wasn't going to survive, but I loved her character so much. She was so clever and innocent, and the story of her whole upbringing in District 11, where it's clear that she faced even more oppressive circumstances, even compared to District 12. And so I loved when Katniss thought, I can almost hear Haymitch groaning as I team up with this wispy child, but I want her because she's a survivor and I trust her. And why not admit it? She reminds me of Prim.
Oh.
I think overall, Rue represents a blend of things for Katniss. She has the sweet innocence of Prim, but she also has that will to live and a strength that Katniss has herself. And so there's some mutual respect in that as well.
I think so too. And mostly what I have to say is, Rue! No! I'm sorry, guys. I will get over the White Lotus thing, I promise. It's just so fun.
We won't.
It's just so applicable in so many situations. But really, this entire plot with Rue was just absolutely gut-wrenching for so many reasons. But specifically for me, the audiobook narrator does such a phenomenal job with Rue's voice. I was actually listening to the start of this whole plot line in Target, and just hearing Rue's voice and her dialogue had me tearing up, man. I was like, oh shit, I gotta get out of here. I swear, I'm always crying in a Target.
I was about to say, I was laughing because I was like, of course you were in a Target. That really tracks.
That's the only place I go. I never do anything else fun. Okay, that's the only thing to do around where I live is go to Target.
No hate, no shame. I love a good Target too, so.
Yeah. No, I swear, every time for every book we read, I'm like, oh my God, Lorraine, I was listening to the part when I was in Target.
Yeah,
and she's
I
like,
know,
again,
yeah.
Addison. Or in the car, Target or the car,
Yeah.
or in the car on the way to Target.
Yeah. Yep. Anyways, to get back on track, I also found their whole scheme to blow up the supplies just really fascinating because, Katniss made the statement to the game makers in the beginning by shooting the apple. And then in this scene, she shoots down a bag of apples, which causes a chain reaction to blow up the entire area. And so it's just building on this idea that one small thing can make such a huge impact. So I thought that was a cool little
Oh, that's a
there.
nice touch. Yeah, good call out.
Last but not least, I loved how Katniss chose to honor Rue rather than let her become another mindless death in the games. And it says, slowly, one stem at a time, I decorate her body in the flowers. They'll have to show it. Or even if they choose to turn the cameras elsewhere at this moment, they'll have to bring them back when they collect the bodies and everyone will see her then and know I did it. Rest in peace.
R.I.P. Rue's death is just so gut-wrenching on so many levels. It's such a tragic and beautiful scene both in the books and the movies. And I also want to add, in particular for the movies, that the score for this movie in general was really amazing, but particularly the music for this scene, like how Katniss turns to the camera and then she presses her fingers to her lips and does the 3-finger symbol in solidarity. And I literally have goosebumps just thinking about it because it's just so well done. I also feel like the importance of Rue's death cannot be understated. It is an absolutely pivotal moment for Katniss's character. As this is all unfolding, it's described, "Then I remember Peeta's words on the roof, and for the first time, I understand what he means. I want to do something right here, right now, to shame them, to make them accountable, to show the Capitol that whatever they do or force us to do, there is a part of every tribute they can't own. That Rue was more than a piece in their game, and so am I." That quote just punches you, right? It has a lot of impact, and the whole way the moment builds, and it's just good writing. It's good writing. I'll say it. It is what it is.
Oh my gosh. And then, to follow a gut-wrenching moment with another one, I definitely teared up even more when District 11 then sends the gift of bread to Katniss. It says, "This is a first, a district gift to a tribute who's not your own." And I definitely get the sense that we're going to see a greater movement of resistance in the next book. I've kind of touched on that already, like with Cinna's character and Haymitch and everything, but Katniss's undercurrent of rebellion certainly sparked something among the other districts, and her behavior in the games proved that the districts should not really be enemies competing against each other, but ultimately they are all victims of the same system, and there is strength in unifying.
Chef's kiss, Lorraine. You said it perfectly. This is honestly almost exactly what I wrote in my quick notes for the scene before I fleshed out my thoughts. It's a perfect example of how Katniss is not aware of the effect she can have on people, but there is clearly something about her that touches people and, more importantly, ignites them in a unifying way. And you're definitely going to find out more about how the districts perceive the games in the next book.
Ooh, yikes. Yeah, they're definitely not happy, that's for sure. And last but not least, with part 2, that rule change that we got at the end there. I actually was really excited reading this because you're like, okay, great, this is super cool.
We're going to make it. We're going to survive.
Hope. Yeah, everything's going to work out. Peeta's going to live. Katniss is going to live. But then Capitol they had to do him dirty. And so it really pissed me off when they tried to rescind it later. Those bitches. But... But it was also really interesting to see how that affected Katniss, right? You see this really sudden change of relief and then desperation from Katniss to now go and find Peeta because she realizes that she can. And it's the first big moment where she lets herself hope.
I think about this rule change, and I bet the game makers forget that choice every damn day. I know they did it to prompt action and force the tributes to battle it out, but ultimately, it was their fatal error that set off a chain reaction of events that forever will alter the history of Panem. So I'll say that. They fucked around and they found out, or they're going to find out.
Yeah. All right. So as far as some character analysis goes, I mostly kind of just focused on Katniss's development at this point because she's who we primarily see in this section. So I felt like we begin to see Katniss develop a sense of the bigger game at play and how messed up it all actually is. She also starts thinking outside the system from other people's perspectives, for example, Haymitch and the game makers and everything. And I have a few quotes that I think support this. "It's not hard to follow the game maker's motivation. The Spire is designed to flush us out, to drive us together. It may not be the most original device, but it's very effective." So Katniss understanding, what the games are doing and being able to get a sense for what she will expect them to do. And she's anticipating the game maker's moves. And then last, we have Rue's death has forced me to confront my own fury against the cruelty, the injustice they inflict upon us. There's no way to take revenge on the Capitol, is there? And then I remember Peeta's words on the roof, and for the first time, I understand what he means. I also felt like we then see a transition in how Katniss views Peeta. She finally begins to question what Peeta's motive was up until this point, and she considers that perhaps he hasn't actually been working against her. The quote that I had to support this was, "Peeta, he saved my life, I think. Because by the time we met up, I couldn't tell what was real and what the Tracker Jacker venom had caused me to imagine. But if he did, and my instincts tell me he did, what for? Is he simply working the lover boy angle he initiated at the interview, or was he actually trying to protect me?" All right. So moving on to part 3, the victor. So I think by the last third of this book, we see a major shift in Katniss's attitude and feelings toward Peeta, and she fully grasps the importance of the strategy Peeta and Haymitch had laid the foundation for from the very beginning. And it's really imperative that she do her part to work the, star-crossed lovers role, because it is quite literally how they will survive, because it's how they keep the audience invested in their survival. And the audience investment is what motivates the capital to keep them alive as well. But on the other hand, you really see Katniss also struggle to sort out her true feelings for Peeta. I think she definitely cares for him, but we also see that she doesn't have a choice but to do so because of their need to survive. That would honestly be a really tough position to be in. And at the end of the day, they will all have to go back to their realities, which were separate in different experiences before they were brought together by the games. I also think that we see a shift through all of this into a larger defiance against the Capitol for all of their cruelty in starting this in the first place. So Katniss more clearly sees the bigger picture, and we're being set up for the plot moving forward, I think. In terms of favorite scenes or thought-provoking moments, these are some things that stuck out to me. First of all, I was so relieved when Katniss finds Peeta, and turns out he is excellent at camouflaging. I love the tie-in from the beginning of Peeta having this unique skill set, and then Katniss finding him completely disguised as like a muddy weed bank. And I also love that despite his almost dead condition, he still has a sense of humor and says, "Yes, frosting, the final defense of the dying." So there's also been several times when it's alluded that Haymitch was primarily concerned with helping Katniss, but when Peeta says, "I always knew you were his favorite because you're just alike," it really made it ultra clear. And at the end of the day, it's kind of true. I think Katniss and Haymitch share a lot of the same mindset as realists, and I think Haymitch recognizes the bare bones survivalist mentality that Katniss has, and he also knows that she's intelligent enough to learn the subtle cues and signals that he was sending throughout the games to steer her in the right direction. They also share a certain hardened, no bullshit outlook that obviously differs from Peeta's gentler, dreamer outlook. I think Peeta's charm and personality was needed for the story, but at the end of the day, everyone kind of knew that Katniss was the one who had the hard skills necessary to stay alive.
That's really interesting. I never really considered how they balance each other out. We see throughout the games how intelligent Katniss is. She's constantly thinking through her next steps and her strategy for the game, but also the other players in the game and how that impacts their own strategies and how that cascades through hers. Whereas, of course, we don't get Peeta's POV, but I think you're right. He's not thinking about the games at all in the way that Katniss is.
I also really like the story of how Katniss got a goat for Prim.
Aw,
Prim is
yeah.
such a huge motivation for Katniss, and keeping her safe and happy is a core part of Katniss's character because she loves Prim so deeply. Honestly, Prim is the only person that she's really allowed herself to truly love. And to me, it feels Katniss has generally avoided allowing herself to explore or love others in her life because the reality is that those people can easily be taken away with how hard life generally is in District 12. So I think she feels it's easier to keep things, transactional with people because it's less painful or confusing to navigate. But at the same time, you do start to see this change for Katniss, who learns everything about how Peeta actually has genuinely been a kind person because that is who he is without necessarily expecting anything in return. And I think that's helped open her mind up to the possibility of letting herself care for other people like Gale or Peeta and explore what it would be like to have that when typically love seems to be considered more of a luxury to her prior to this. I also was really touched by Thresh's actions for that cornucopia feast gift scene. I think Katniss's humanity and respect for another being was exactly the thing that saved her, and Thresh understood the significance of what Katniss did for Rue. So in turn, he risked his own life because Katniss thinks he'll have to go back and face a district that has already broken all the rules to thank me, and he is breaking the rules to thank me too. Thinking more about Thresh specifically, Katniss thinks conflicting emotions cross Thresh's face. Just this one time, I let you go. For the little girl, you and me were even then, no more owed.
This is such an unbelievable scene. It's so intense. And when I say I was literally on the edge of my seat, I meant it. Because you just really feel like she's a goner. First, Clove gets a hold of her, and she's a psycho, okay? And then out of nowhere, Thresh kills Clove, and you're like, oh, thank God. But then you're like, oh no, fucking Thresh is here. You're like, oh shit. It's a great scene in the book. I really keyed in on the quote you read, especially where he says, you and me were even, no more owed. And this made me call back to how Katniss is always talking about how she hates owing people and hates owing Peeta for the bread. I think this sentiment is similar across the districts, that even though they have so little, they can't stand to let a debt go unpaid. There's something about societal circumstances that they're in, that there's something about that that's just unbearable. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting mirrored sentiment between the two characters. Because, I mean, Thresh has no reason to not kill her. We don't know what Thresh and Rue's relationship, but presumably they're not related in any way, shape, or form. But there's still this camaraderie between the tributes and then how Katniss treated her and this like protective nature because she was so young. So all of that I thought was really interesting. Once Katniss gets back from the feast, she gives Peeta the medicine and she basically goes unconscious, and it's described, the last thing I remember is an exquisitely beautiful green and silver moth landing on the curve of my wrist. And this detail really stood out to me because it's kind of a random detail and it doesn't really fit with the arena. Katniss isn't really talking about the beauty of things or something unique. And so, of course, I had to do a little research. So typically, moths and butterflies in literature represent the transformation of a character. And so the moth landing on Katniss's wrist is meant to signify Katniss's transformation and her growing empathy and understanding of the world beyond self-preservation. It also represents an expansion of her compassion moving forward in this book and for the rest of the series.
Yeah. I love symbolism. I love the themes.
Oh, we know, Lorraine. We know.
And to continue with some other notable scenes, I was really smitten with the whole scene when Katniss gets back from the cornucopia feast with the medicine. And then we see the roles kind of reverse and Peeta becomes the one to take care of Katniss in the cave. And we get the whole backstory of Peeta having a crush on her since they were like 5 years old. I found it interesting because Katniss has always had to be the one to care for everyone else in her life, except with Gale, who was her trusted equal. But she also has never let herself think about anything romantic with Gale either. But now, with Peeta in this small cave where it's just the two of them, she gets to experience care and love. But simultaneously, it continues to be confusing because she doesn't know how to sort out what's real and what's the game, or ultimately whether she can trust it at all. I think Katniss does have feelings for Peeta, but she's resisting because she fundamentally just doesn't trust being loved. And this is demonstrated by her thought, this is the first kiss where I actually feel stirring inside my chest, warm and curious. But then shortly after, she thinks, no one has held me like this in such a long time. Since my father died and I stopped trusting my mother, no one else's arms have made me feel this safe.
And yet, this is the girl who still is like, Peeta, it's all just for show. This scene, I like it. It drives me nuts because I'm like, girl, how can you not know this boy for real loves you? And also that you have feelings for him. You're an idiot. Like, you're driving me nuts.
I know, but I think it really just has to do with the fact that she just doesn't trust it because I think it's so unfamiliar to her. She just doesn't know how to deal with it. So she's like, I'm just going to be suspicious because that's easier. Because it is. Like, love is such a vulnerable thing, you know?
Yeah.
So
honestly, I'm just thinking about 16-year-old me, and I would have fell for that shit hook, line, and sinker.
I know.
I would have got so quick. And Katniss is just like, Peeta Millar.
Boy, bread boy. Give me all the bread, Peeta. I will take it all.
Bread.
Thank you.
Oh my God. On a more serious note, something else that this scene really hit home for me is how badly I want another book that covers the events of this one, but from multiple people's perspectives. I'm thinking Prim, Gale, her mom, Haymitch, and especially Haymitch, because throughout this whole sequence of events when they're in the cave, I would love to see scenes of him like in the control room watching the evolution of him going from being like a drunk to someone who is fighting through his trauma to stay sober enough to actually help them, and his thoughts and talking to the sponsors, and then like Gale, and just I would literally die for that because there's just so many moments that I think you could do it. You could weave together something that would just be really, really interesting. And like throwing us in a perspective too, or, I think it's a golden opportunity.
I really like that.
After Ballad of Songbird Snake came out, I kind of thought she'd be done with the universe. And then Sunrise on the Reaping came out. And they're going to make it into a movie, I'm pretty sure. And so I'm really hopeful that because it's had this like renewed success, that she'll continue writing in the universe and maybe we'll get some things like that.
That would be really cool. I am such a big fan of multiple POVs. I just love being in everybody's brains and seeing like everything.
There is another character who comes into play in the next book who is, from my perspective, a fan favorite, also my favorite characters. And that particular character, you could totally do a book on them. We'll talk about it in book 2, but I really hope we get some more books.
Let's petition Suzanne Collins.
Yes.
Like, hey.
Okay, deal.
Please.
We'll make a petition, guys. I really think she will. Seeing how well Ballad of Songbird Snake did in Sunrise on the Reaping, I think she'll continue to write in the universe.
Ooh. Well, that makes me very excited.
I know.
Okay. Another devastating or just like shocking scene was everything that happened with that final cornucopia scene. That just had my heart racing. My anxiety was sky high. You have such a back and forth of emotions from like thinking Katniss and Peeta would lose to then thinking that they could and then screaming at the Capitol for trying to rescind the rule that they changed. It was so hectic, you know?
During the feasting, I kept wondering what everyone's gift was that they really needed. And I had forgotten the detail on this read about Cato's body armor that could deflect Katniss's arrows, which it's just so messed up that the Capitol did that because they wanted the fight to be as physical and bloody as possible. But then, and I totally forgotten about this, later with the mutations and how it prolongs his suffering because he has this impenetrable body armor. And we'll talk about it when we get there. Well, actually, not when we get there. We're there right now, so we'll talk about it in just a minute. But it is fucking sickening. Oh, it's horrible to read and even worse to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, look, my next note. Speaking of, what a special kind of fucked up hell that was to make the Mutts look like the dead tributes.
I know.
That is some unhinged shit. And then when Katniss is thinking about, do they give them like some of the memories or the emotions? They feel like they're engaging in their own act of revenge. That's crazy. Truly sadistic. Yes. And so I was actually happy. And also a little disappointed because it's a good plot device that they omitted that detail from the movie. And the movie, they just look like these weird, like kind of dog, wolf, whatever. And they omit that part. And I was happy, but disappointed because it's just another way of just showing the cruelty of the games.
Yeah. But anyways, thank God while they're on top of the cornucopia, Peeta pointed out Cato's exposed hand so that she could shoot him. But then, as you mentioned, the prolonging of Cato's suffering and just how it took so long for it to finally die. While then simultaneously, Peeta is also like bleeding out. So like you very well could have lost Peeta just waiting for Cato to die. So.
I think that's what they wanted, honestly. I mean, I think they're...
that's true, because
they control the Mutts. So they could have made those Mutts rip out his throat in one bite and be done with it. But they manipulated them so that they would just basically slowly bite him to death, which is just... it's awful. So once Cato actually dies, they go back to the lake. And something that stood out to me about that is when Peeta is trying to just let himself bleed out so Katniss can win, Katniss thinks, because if he dies, I'll never go home. Not really. I'll spend the rest of my life in this arena trying to think my way out. I think this is such a poignant quote that you and I discussed a little bit earlier in the episode, but even victors are not really victors. And there's also some more information we learn in book 2 and 3 that shows that being a victor is not all that you think it is. There's some other like insidious things going on with the victors that is really interesting, I think.
Oh.
Yeah. You'll find out.
Like they turn them into mouthpieces and pawns for the Capitol. Because in many ways, they kind of like control.
They're still controlled and manipulated by the Capitol. And that's its own special form of torture. Yeah, you'll find out. But this quote is also foreshadowing for later in this series. But it also plays into this continual theme of Katniss can't stand the thought of owing Peeta. And if he dies here and now, she can never pay him back. And that's not something I think that she could live with. And so when I had that realization, I was like, oh, she really cannot let him die because then he'll be the boy with the bread and the boy who died for her. And how do you ever move past that? For Katniss, you don't. You can't move past it.
The boy who died for her. I don't like that. I guess on a more clever note here to get us a little bit out of the sadness. I did think Katniss's move at the very end was really clever with the berries to fake their deaths. She knew the one thing the Capitol absolutely needed was a victor. That was their leverage. And she thinks without a victor, the whole thing would blow up in the game makers' faces. They'd have failed the Capitol. So she's gaming the system from within in many ways, too. Next, the post-game scenes and chapters were also really interesting because I felt like it advances us into the bigger plot. And I kind of wonder, how will Katniss navigate life now that she has defied the system? Will she get back in line, or will this propel her into a new path of looking for ways to continue changing the system now?
You're going to have to read and find out. I also thought it was a sweet moment when she finally gets out of the hospital and she sees Haymitch for the first time and she runs into his arms and they embrace and he tells her, "Nice job, sweetheart." Yeah. I don't know. There's something about that that's really sweet.
I agree. Now that Katniss has won, there, of course, is definitely going to be hell to pay if she continues to show her defiance because the Capitol knows her actions in the games could very well incite a problem for them and make them look like the enemy. And there's a quote that contributes to that. It's where she thinks, "But the Hunger Games are their weapon and you are not supposed to be able to defeat it. So now the Capitol will act as if they've been in control the whole time, as if they orchestrated the whole event, right down to the double suicide. But that will only work if I play along with them."
Speaking to this kind of idea that she has to play along, if I didn't love Cinna already, I would by this point. The scene when he's dressing her for the recap of the games and he's ever so carefully hinting that she's not safe, and just how intentional he was in dressing her so innocently, like this small, 14-year-old airheaded girl. It's just so clever and ominous in its own way that he has to go to such lengths to curate this perception of her, all to keep her safe. And so I thought that was really an interesting detail. And also, I just fucking love Cinna. I want a Cinna book. I want to know what his deal is. I know we talked about that earlier, but man, I love him. This is also a very small thing, but in the book, Peeta loses part of his leg from his injuries. But in the movie, they show nothing of the sort, which is kind of annoying because it is relevant to Peeta's character. I mean, it impacts his physical mobility, which I can't say a ton more, but is important in the next book. So I find it kind of annoying that they did not include that detail in the movie.
Yeah, that is annoying. I wonder why they did that.
I don't know. It's a good question.
I am also really interested to see how things change for Katniss once she's back in reality. I think there's a lot that she needs to sort out in terms of her feelings for Peeta, dealing with basically being target number one in the eyes of the Capitol, as well as just her own sense of self and identity again. I guess to continue feeding on this idea that obviously the Capitol is on to her now, there's the quote where it says, "President Snow, he's still smiling when he settles the second on my head, but his eyes, just inches from mine, are as unforgiving as the stakes. I'm the instigator. I'm the one to be punished." And then post-final interview and everything, at the quote where it says, "As I slowly, thoroughly wash the makeup from my face and put my hair in its braid, I begin transforming back into myself. Katniss Everdeen, a girl who lives in the same, hunts in the woods, trades in the hob. I stare in the mirror as I try to remember who I am and who I am not." And then as far as sorting out her feelings for Peeta and Gale and just relationships and stuff, she thinks, "I want to tell him that he's not being fair, that we were strangers, that I did what it took to stay alive, to keep us both alive in the arena. That if I do have feelings for him, it doesn't matter because I'll never be able to afford the kind of love that leads to a family, to children. And how can he? How can he after what we've just been through? I also want to tell him how much I already miss him, but that wouldn't be fair on my part."
Okay, so Lorraine, I have to ask, and I'll ask you after probably each book, but by the end of this book, what are your overall feelings on Katniss and her romantic entanglement with Gale and Peeta? Like, are you team Gale? Are you team Peeta? Are you team I don't know? Are you like, I don't even care at all about the romance? Tell me.
Oh, well, okay. I really like PETA a lot, like as a character, but you can tell that Katniss, I think she kind of has feelings, but she also is so realistic about her life. She just like doesn't consider the possibility of it. Even in that last quote that I read, how can he after what we've just been through? It doesn't matter because I'll never be able to afford the kind of love that leads to a family, to children. And I think for Katniss, it feels like she doesn't really want to bring children into the world because she doesn't want them to experience the suffering because she doesn't feel like it's actually going to end. None of what's going on is going to be resolved. So, it feels like she doesn't see the point of going down that road because she views it as just an extension of a cycle of just making people's lives bad, I guess, which I don't personally feel that way. I think I resonate with PETA because I generally have a little bit more of an optimistic outlook.
You do. You're a dreamer,
times.
baby.
I know.
You're sweet PETA.
And so sometimes I wonder if those ideologies are too different for them to overcome. I think they do like balance each other well, but I just don't know if at the end of the day their outlooks are going to be able to mesh enough for them to really have a relationship, at least not until things were to change significantly within the system.
Yeah.
But, on the opposite end of that, then you do see that Gale is very much like her. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but Katniss, I don't think feels like she ever has to explain herself to Gale. There's just like an understanding because they have the same lived experience. And so I think there is comfort in that.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see. But like at the end, she clearly cares for PETA, but she's more concerned with just surviving. And so it's like, how do you really let yourself think about experiencing the pure joy of love when literally your life is at risk? So
yeah. I feel like it all comes down to this repeated theme and idea is that dreams, thoughts of a future for something better are a luxury she cannot afford. She just cannot afford to think that way.
Yeah. Which is really sad because love is nice. Oh, like
you're so sweet summer child. You're so sweet. You would get got in the first 3 minutes of the games. Okay. You would be like, maybe we can all be friends. Nope.
Hey, there's a strategy for that. I'll go the Sour Patch angle. I'll just be really sweet at first, and then I'll just get him in the night with never let him
let him know your next move.
Catch him off guard,
Also, I think you mix that up. I think you have to be sour first and then sweet. I don't think you got that right.
Oh, reverse Sour Patch.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
That's me. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, okay. So moving on to a little bit of final character analysis here. I think we really start to see Katniss open herself up to thinking about other people from the perspective of trying to understand them now and see why they feel or behave or think the things that they do. For example, with Hey Mitch, she has that quote that you pointed out at the very beginning. She thinks maybe he wasn't always a drunk. Maybe in the beginning he tried to help the tributes, but then it got unbearable. It must be hell to mentor 2 kids and then watch them die year after year after year. I realized that if I get out of here, that will become my job, to mentor the girl from District 12. The idea is so repellent, I thrust it from my mind. I also think Katniss is confronted with the reality of the future when she thinks, for the first time, I allow myself to truly think about the possibility that I might make it home, a new kind of freedom. But then what? What would my life be like on a daily basis? Most of it has been consumed with the acquisition of food. Take that away, and I'm not really sure who I am, what my identity is. The idea scares me some. And then she also has decided that she doesn't want to marry and risk bringing a child into this world because if there's one thing being a victor doesn't guarantee, it's your children's safety. My kids' names would go right into the reaping balls with everyone else's, and I swear I'll never let that happen. I think ultimately this speaks to the idea that Katniss just does not trust the world that she lives in, and honestly, why should she? She doesn't see a way to get around the system and therefore doesn't see a point to dreaming about a better future, but she also doesn't want to have anyone else suffer in the same existence. Personally, I feel like that's a little defeatist because I am a dreamer like PETA, but I totally understand, that sentiment. And at its core, her outlook comes from a place of, I think, compassion for others, to not want other people to suffer.
Yeah.
So next, I have a couple thoughts on Haymitch as well. I think through Katniss's evaluation of him, we see that there is a lot more to uncover about Haymitch's past and experience with the games. It's clear that despite being a degenerate drunkard most of the time, Haymitch is well aware of the system, and I would reckon he's pretty smart. I think he's lost a lot of hope up until now, but you kind of see a reignited spark of hope and a change in his demeanor when he finally got tributes who he felt could actually win for the first time in who knows how long. So lots of questions about Haymitch. All right, so that ends the discussion of the main part of the book. So now we just have some predictions and then our book ratings and favorite moments left, starting with some predictions.
So because I have read the series, I will be silent for this portion of the episode because I can either confirm or deny anything.
Okay, so first and foremost, I think we're going to see Katniss grapple with what to do because the games have fundamentally changed her outlook and she knows much more about the larger system now. So I think it's going to be a big part of her character development moving forward. In a similar vein, we are definitely set up for more of a resistance trajectory for the larger plot. And I think Katniss will play the lead role in unraveling the entire system. She's definitely probably going to become a mentor for the next game, so I'm curious to see what she does in that role. I also think we're going to get a little possible love triangle situation going on as Katniss tries to figure out her feelings for Gale and Peeta. Addison's covering her mouth and her face.
I realized very quickly that my mouth won't say it, but my face will. And I was like, I need to cover my face for these predictions because I will accidentally, inadvertently confirm or deny. So I'm just like
wrong on something.
Oh my God, I want you to start the second book tonight. Can you just stay up all night and read it, please?
We'll see. And then last but not least, I think we're going to learn more about the rebellion because this was only the 74th Hunger Games. So it really hasn't been that long from like a historical context, I guess, under this new system. So I believe like understanding more of that will help Katniss figure out what to do next. Because Katniss had that like little brief thought, I think towards the beginning where they don't know exactly what happened or whatever, but a rebellion started somewhere somehow, and we just never got like the full story of what incited all of it in the first place. So I'm curious. I have some questions.
Okay.
And those are all my predictions. Okay, so moving on to the book rating. So one thing you should know about me is that when I'm not critically reading a book, I hand out 5 stars like candy. So 5 stars for me. I thought that the pacing of the book went really well. I really never felt like there was a slow or unnecessary part while reading. Everything felt relevant to driving the plot, but despite the fast-paced nature, I don't think we lost out on important character development or strong emotional moments and scenes so that we could connect with the characters and the larger theme for the story. And speaking of theme, I felt that was really strong and was displayed well through a variety of viewpoints. For example, seeing the difference in outlooks between Katniss and Peeta, seeing how Haymitch kind of progresses and changes as the games progress as well, and just the whole vantage point of using the games as a system of entertainment, also really drives the plot and the theme really well. So
retweet 1 million times, especially about how the story moves. It truly is paced so well. For those of you who have been listening for a little while, this will shock you, but I will also be giving this book 5 stars. It's a first for me on this podcast. I really do think it's perfection, though. I think the world building is excellent. The characters are great, as is their growth during the book. There's all these incredible action sequences, but also balanced with these really meaningful and emotional moments. But then also woven in is this undercurrent of this politically charged nature of events that is always present. I think it's masterful. I really do. I think it's a great book.
I 100% agree. And now to give, I guess, just a little more context with some likes and dislikes. I honestly love this book so much. I am definitely biased, however, towards dystopian sci-fi fantasy because it's a category I've always been super drawn towards. So that does influence why I like it so much. So just keep that in mind. I think it did a really good job of highlighting themes about society and the real world in a way that really hits home. I think by utilizing people that we all innately feel a desire to protect, like children, it really highlights the cruelty of the capital and the nature of the districts. And despite all of that, I love seeing Katniss navigate this world and find her own way to survive and defy the capital. I also thought the cast of characters was really great with, a variety of people representing different roles and also different classes, all of whom are, at the end of the day, I guess ultimately pieces to play by the capitals. You see how they think about everything as well. And I, of course, also love the subtle undercurrent of resistance the whole time. So I'm excited to see how that plays out in other books.
Honestly, for me, there were so many things to like about this book. The action sequences were great. The world building was excellent. I felt there was real resolutions to the conflicts within the story, but at the same time, we're set up really nicely for the next book in the series, and I'm really big on that. Probably a little bit colored by coming off of Onyx Storm and how I feel about the resolution of stories and within that book, but that's really important to me. It's really important to me. One of my favorite parts of this book is Katniss's character growth. It's really well done in this gradual and yet impactful way. And I'm excited to re-experience her growth throughout the series. As Lorraine mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the pacing of this book is just excellent. It builds really well. And I think people really undervalue how important pacing is in a story because it's so important. And it's just really well done in this book.
So I did have just like one small dislike, believe it or not. So
Boo.
I am a little bit disappointed that even if the love wasn't real for Katniss and the relationship couldn't work out with Peeta, I kind of wish that it could have been driven at least to a point where they could be friends. I feel like we kind of like left off at this point of tension with them where Katniss is like, we're in trouble now. I don't have time to think about these feelings for you because shit's about to go down, okay, Peeta? But meanwhile, Peeta is just like, what? So all of this was fake? There's like unresolved stuff going on and I just feel like it's gonna fester and I don't really like that. But I feel like we kind of had a missed opportunity for them to be allies together and develop a friendship rather than go to like a possible like rejected lover route with Peeta. You know what I mean? So
I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to have to disagree because you have to keep in mind they aren't really given the opportunity or the time to become friends because the timeline of this book is extremely condensed. It's like 2 weeks tops.
Right.
From the very get-go, they both know one of them will die. And so who wants to form a friendship with someone who will be dead in a week? And worst case, they become friends and one of them has to kill the other. And so I don't blame Katniss or Suzanne Collins at all for that. There's no way any rational person would develop that kind of attachment or connection to someone. It just, no, not plausible. Bad Lorraine. Okay. Take it back.
No. Well, I'm hoping that they can be friends, though. Like, I don't think it's going to stay like this. And you made a really good point with how quickly everything happened. I often forget in books. Sometimes when you're reading them, it feels like it's been so much longer than it actually has. Then when you're like, oh, wait, it's actually only been 2 weeks. Yeah, like there's no way they could like go from people who didn't know each other to fake lovers to friends in that short period of a time. So
not to mention they've just experienced a major trauma together. So
true.
Well, for me, I really tried. But honestly, I really don't have any dislikes with this book. I really, really enjoyed it. And the only thing I guess I'll add is this is not even a dislike or a criticism, but just something I would love is, as I mentioned earlier, a POV book from Gail Prim Hamish. Yeah. I would love that. But that's just like, because it's so good, I just want more.
Oh, you know what would be really interesting is a POV from a Capitol member like President Snow.
Ooh, well, you're not going to believe this, Lorraine. The Ballad of Songbird and Snake is all about President Snow.
Oh, is it really? Oh, dang.
Oh, yeah. It's his origin story, actually.
Oh, shit.
Shit. I'm thinking about it. You're going to love that book. You're going to go feral for that shit. I know you are. So we'll do that fourth, guys. We'll do that after the end of the trilogy. We're doing it in publishing order, how the books are published.
All right. Well, to wrap up this episode, we of course have some favorite moments.
Yeah, we do. My first favorite moment is when Effie Trinket says, "But I said, and this was very clever of me, I said, well, if you put enough pressure on coal, it turns to pearls." I just love Effie.
My first one was Katniss's thought in the very first tribute scene when she notes that everybody's silent and it says, "So instead of acknowledging applause, I stand there unmoving while they take part in the boldest form of dissent they can manage. Silence."
That's a very impactful moment. It's good. My next two are, I mentioned this earlier, but I love when Katniss at the end jumps into Haymitch's arms and he says, "Nice job, sweetheart." I like that the sweetheart thing kind of gets played around. And like when Peeta pretends to be Haymitch, she's like, "Come here, sweetheart." And she's like, "Ugh."
Well, and the transition of like the tone of that too, right? It starts off as like condescending sweetheart, and then it turns into "I'm proud of you. Great job," like sweetheart. So that was kind of nice.
I also loved / hated, I don't know, it just destroyed me when Katniss sings "Deep in the Meadow" to Rue. This one hit me especially hard this time around because it is actually a song I sing to my own children. So I was like really having a super hard time because I mean, like I started singing this to them when they were babies, like literally babies. So it was
Ooh. I didn't realize this is like a real song. I thought this was like a made-up song for the book.
It is. But then Jennifer Lawrence actually has a recorded version of "Deep in the Meadow." I'll send it to you after this. Yeah, it's from the soundtrack.
Well, okay, guys, if you didn't know, I guess we'll add this into the episode description so that you can all find it. Oh, go figure. My next one that I liked was the chariot scene at the beginning of the games, and it's when Katniss thinks, "No one will forget me, not my look, not my name, Katniss, the girl who was on fire."
Oh, that's a great quote. It stands the test of time so well. I also love Katniss's private session with the game makers, especially the final "Thank you for your consideration," and then she pieces out. I mean, who doesn't love that?
Yeah. My next favorite one was after Rue passes. The quote says, "Another mockingjay, a young one by the look of it, lands on the branch before me and bursts out Rue's melody. My song, The Hovercraft, were too unfamiliar for this novice to pick up, but it has mastered her handful of notes, the ones that mean she's safe."
Oh, now I'm sad again.
I know.
Damn it, Lorraine. My last favorite moment is Katniss often refers to Peeta in her thoughts as the boy with the bread. And each time she does that, I find it really, really meaningful. And there's something about it that just touches me in a way. And there's a couple times where she thinks it, specifically when she thinks, "I do not want to lose the boy with the bread." Or at the very end when she thinks, "Already the boy with the bread is slipping away from me." Oh, I don't know. I just love it. And I hate it. And all the feelings.
The boy with the bread.
The boy with the bread.
Pita bread.
Give us this day our daily pita bread.
Oh my God. Okay, yeah. In a similar vein of loving Peeta, my final favorite moment was when Katniss thinks, "No one has held me like this in such a long time since my father died, and I stopped trusting my mother. No one else's arms have made me feel this safe."
Aww.
Now I really want them to work out, but I kind of don't think they will. That makes me sad. Addison's covering her face again, so.
Only one way to find out.
Yeah.
Ooh, man. Okay.
Well, we hope you guys enjoyed our very first Pacing the Past episode, and we hope that in the future you guys will join us for more of them. So thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Book Dump Fantasy Podcast. As always, we're so glad you found us, so please leave us a review, subscribe to the podcast, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube to keep up with us on a daily basis. That's all we've got for you guys today, so stay nerdy.
And may the odds be ever in your favor.
We'll catch you all next week for our regular scheduled episodes. Bye!
Bye! And stay tuned for some bloopers. Katniss gently covers Rue's. Okay. I'm trying to say like ruse, not like it's all a ruse, you know? Okay.
Yeah. And within that line, obviously, oops, sorry. I skipped.
You skipped me. Okay, I put myself on mute. I feel like I'm breathing really loud, so I keep putting myself on mute because I feel like I'm over here like.
That's all we've got for you guys today, so stay nerdy. Oops. Damn it. I do
Lorraine!
Keep reading. I get into reading mode and I just like read. Okay.
You autopilot that shit so hard.
Yeah.
I wrote Beyonce self-preservation.
Yes.
Girls who run the world.
Yes. I love that better.
Beyonce
Yeah.
self-preservation. I'm dying right now. Oh my God.
That's funny.